Thank you, Liz, for a really wonderful talk on the temple rules. You know, every now and then, actually more often than now and then, you know, the person making the talk gives such a great talk, and I always wish it was recorded. That was definitely one that I wish was recorded. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
How did Mahayana arise?
How did Mahayana arise? That's a really good question. I'm not sure what an answer would be. There's this theory. So Buddhism falls into three major schools. There's Theravada, which is Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, places like that. There's Mahayana, China, Korea, Japan, Vietnam. And there's Vajrayana, Tibetan Buddhism, Tibet, Mongolia, roughly, you know, Nepal also. So there's these three schools of Buddhism. It's very clear that the Vajrayana came out of the Mahayana. The sort of story that people tell is that the Mahayana came out of the Theravada. In fact, that's kind of the story that the Mahayana tells itself. And in Mahayana, people used to call the Theravada Hinayana, which means lesser vehicle, and Mahayana is greater vehicle. But in fact, Mahayana and Theravada sort of grew up around, sort of in response to each other. It's not clear what the Buddha's actual early teaching is because the sutras were written down a couple of hundred years after the Buddha. So it's not really clear what the history of these things is. There's a very different flavor to most of the Mahayana sutras than the Sanskrit sutras compared to the Pali suttas. So those were the two languages, Pali and Sanskrit, that the very early sutras or suttas were written in. But it's not really clear. There are many schools and sub-schools and sub-schools of Buddhism. And even within the Theravada, even within the Mahayana, even within the Vajrayana, there are many schools. Zen is a part of the Mahayana. And, you know, people can get very attached to their school. There was a time when there was one school of Tibetan Buddhism that was trying to kill people in another school of Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, it can get really ugly. But yeah, so I can't really answer that question except to say that it's more complicated than the stories that we're usually told. The basic difference between the Theravada and the Mahayana is that the Theravada emphasizes impermanence and the Mahayana emphasizes emptiness. And the Theravada has a very basic kind of cosmogony, and the Mahayana has a very complex cosmogony with all kinds of sort of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and you know, weird kinds of beings like the Nagas who have the lower body of a dragon, the upper body of human. They live underwater. They have all these, you know, night deities, and it just goes on and on and on. Many heavens, you know, that kind of thing. So the Mahayana is a much more complex cosmogony, which is best seen as metaphorical, and then the Theravada has a much more simplified cosmogony. And then the rhetoric in the Mahayana can get very complicated, and the Theravada tends to be fairly plain speech. But within them, like the Diamond Sutra, is not very complicated rhetoric at all. And Zen, of course, is very down to earth. The Kongans are very down to earth. I mean, they even talk about like shit, you know, dried shit on a stick. Can't get much more down to earth than that. But yeah, if you're interested, you can look it up. Wikipedia is actually a very good source for information on Buddhism. It's kind of shocking how good it is. So if you're interested in something, look it up in Wikipedia and then follow links and go down the rabbit hole, you know, and yeah, okay? Most important is practice. That's always most important. But thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Yes?
If a very intense emotion arises during solo retreat, how do you recommend responding?
So if a very intense emotion arises during a solo retreat, how do you recommend responding? Thank you for your question. I actually did have an experience like that. I mean, many experiences like that, but one that was really, really strong, which I'll get to in a second. So when you're in a solo retreat, there's nobody around, you know. You can't go to the teacher, you can't go to the head Dharma teacher, you can't go to, you know, somebody you trust on the retreat and take them aside and say, help. You're just there on your own. So it's really hard. And it's really easy for strong emotions or intellectual delusions to take over. And by intellectual delusions, I don't mean like, you know, something about some political theory or something. I mean something about like what your kid is doing or your partner is doing or your parents are doing or what's happening on your job. You know, you have this idea about what might be going on behind your back, so to speak, because you're not there. That's very common on solo retreats, is you start sort of thinking about stuff that you actually have no idea because you're in the solo retreat, but there's a temptation to do that. So the most important thing on a retreat is to stick to the schedule, whether it's a group retreat or a solo retreat. The most important is to stick to a schedule. So even if your mind, even if your emotions are in turmoil, you do the bows when you're supposed to bow. You do the chanting when you're supposed to chant. You do the sitting when you're supposed to sit. You do the walking meditation when you're supposed to walk. And what that does is that breaks the kind of control that ideas and emotions can have on people. Because usually we have an idea or we have emotion, we act on it. But you can't, because you have this regular schedule and you are sticking to that schedule by God. Maybe if you break a leg, you get to, you know, not stick to the schedule, but basically you are sticking to the schedule. So that's extremely important in trying to free ourselves of this overwhelming emotion or this overwhelming perseveration of thinking that we have. And then coupled with it is this don't know, this questioning mind. So something comes up and you can't get rid of it, and then you can look at it. What is this? What is this? Is it tall or is it short? Is it hard or is it soft? Is it heavy or is it light? Is it red, white, or blue, or yellow, or green, or purple? You know? You just look at it. What is this? What is its substance? And of course, it has no substance. But if you can just really look at it, then you can see, not think, oh, yes, it has no substance, because then it's still there. But you can see it, you know? Oh, look at that. And also sticking to the schedule helps with that. It helps with us looking at it because it's not affecting our actions. So we can really question its reality. And if you really put your attention into your sitting, your attention into your chanting, your attention into your prostrations, your attention into your walking meditation. When it's time to make a meal, your attention into preparing the meal. When it's time to clean up, your attention into cleaning up the meal. Then whatever it is loses its power because you're not giving it your attention. You're putting your attention elsewhere. And now I'll tell you two experiences that I had with this issue. One was on a 90-day retreat that I did when I was 65. 90 days is a long time. And I was, away. And I had a friend who was going through a very difficult situation. Her daughter and son-in-law were living with her, and she did not get along with her son-in-law. And I was thinking about this. I kept thinking about my friend and her son-in-law and what was going on and how was it for her. And I kept thinking and thinking and thinking and thinking, and finally 2 weeks passed. And then I realized I have no idea what's going on with her and her son-in-law. 2 weeks is a long time. And I'm not going to know for another, 11 weeks, right? I'm not going to know for another 11 weeks. So I could stop thinking about that. So this don't know is very powerful. Even on the very basic, sort of superficial level of, I actually don't know what's going on with my friend and her son-in-law. And then the other was, I think, maybe more what you're talking about, which was this was fairly early on, I guess. Maybe I've been practicing for about 10 or 15 years, and I was doing maybe even less than that. Anyway, I was doing a solo retreat in Massachusetts. Actually, the cabin was built by a guy who became a teacher in our school. I was sitting, no, this was later, I'm sorry, this is later, this is in Colorado, it doesn't matter, this is in Colorado, and I was, sitting, and it was a 3-week solo retreat, and suddenly I felt that I was inhabited by a demon. That's the only way I can put it. I felt that I was inhabited by a demon. And that was all. I mean, there were no, I didn't see any demons, I didn't, my hand didn't start moving out of my control, there was nothing that you'd expect. My head didn't swivel around, nothing that you'd expect to happen it's just, I'm being inhabited by a demon. And it was a very frightening feeling. It was a terrifying feeling. I'm being inhabited by a demon. And I told myself, if I wake up tomorrow and the demon is still there, I'm checking myself into a mental hospital. It was really terrifying. So I'm sitting there and I'm being inhabited by a demon. And I get up to do walking meditation. I was not going to change the schedule. It was time to do walking meditation. I got up to do walking meditation. And I went out on a little porch and I started doing walking meditation. Oh, and the feeling was, I was inhabited by the demon, and the demon was looking out through my eyes. It was very clear. The demon was looking out through my eyes. That was a very important part of my perception of this demon. And so I'm walking on the little porch. And you're walking and there's trees and there's trees and there's trees and there's trees and there's the building and the building and the trees and the trees. So I'm, walking on this porch, and all of a sudden I realize that nothing looks out through my eyes. The world comes in through my eyes, and the demon vanished. There's no being looking out through my eyes ever. Judy doesn't look out through Judy's eyes. The universe comes in through Judy's eyes. The universe comes in through Jane's eyes and Julia's eyes and Shannon's eyes and Todd's eyes and Evelyn's eyes. The universe is coming in. That's what our eyes are about. They're not some being looking out. It's the universe coming in. Boom, the demon was gone. So sticking to the schedule is key here, and paying attention to what was actually happening was key here. And I should add, I'm not a person who goes around believing in demons, in this sense of little beings with pitchforks and horns who jump around and try to hurt people. But I will say that the notion of demon is a very helpful one. Sometimes, when people are overpowered by anger or fear or anxiety, and the notion of considering that as external to the self is a very useful one, because then you don't have to identify with it. Instead of I am angry, anger is appearing. The demon anger, the demon of anger is appearing. You don't have to call it a demon, but it's external to you. Anger is appearing, not I am angry. That's a really useful concept. So that's my response to your question. And sometimes you can't do it yourself. Sometimes you do have to get help. If I'd awakened the next morning with that demon, I would have had to get help. But luckily I didn't. So thank you for your question. And I will add that on any retreat, you need a solid grounding in practice to do any retreat. At least several months of daily practice, serious daily practice. Because the stuff appears. You're very vulnerable when you're sitting in a retreat. Vulnerable in all kinds of ways. And this stuff appears. And it can overwhelm people. So we have retreats and they're absolutely wonderful, but also you have to have a solid grounding. So if you have never sat a retreat before, we always recommend that you contact. Well, if I don't recognize your name, I'll say to you, have you sat a retreat before? What's your practice like? And sometimes I advise people not to do that retreat. Wait a few months. Get more practice under your belt. And that's why, because whatever ontological status they have, these demons will appear. Everyone has them. And do you have the solidity to let them come up and not, grab you by the scruff of your neck and pull you around? That's a really important thing to know about retreats. So thank you for your question. Are there any other questions? Oh, yes, Garrett.
So your story about demons it's actually kind of interesting because this is not the first time in the quantum school that I've heard this referenced. So I was reading Barbara Rhodes' book, and she talks about an experience where she's caring for a mob boss in hospice care. And Sung San recommends chanting the Great Dharani in order to sort of like calm herself down. And sort of at the end of this story, the mob boss wakes up and says, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop that. And it ends with Sung San saying, yeah.
You should add that she was chanting silently.
Okay. But Sung San says, yeah, demons hate the Great Dharani. So I guess I'm just curious, like, I know you had mentioned it here maybe as a personification of emotion, something more tangible that we can wrap our minds around to deal with. I'm specifically curious about maybe what Sung San meant when he said, maybe what he meant by demons in this scenario. And specifically, how does that relate to, something like the Great Dharani?
Okay, so first of all, Korea is a shamanistic culture. Even though for probably millennia, they always tried to suppress shamanism because shamanism is not very amenable to political control. But so most, shamanistic cultures that have large social organization like kingdoms tend to want to suppress the shamans. But anyway, so Korea is a shamanistic culture. Zen Master Sung San was actually, as a kid, he was Presbyterian. His family was Presbyterian. And he started practicing Buddhism as a sort of as an older adolescent is when he started practicing Buddhism. So, but even though he was Presbyterian and then Buddhist, he was from a shamanistic culture. So I'm sure that he believed in the reality of demons in a way that I don't, because he was shamanistic. I mean, his culture was shamanistic. He couldn't help himself. Just, like we have an image of Santa Claus in our minds. I mean, I'm Jewish, but I have an image of Santa Claus, He's a character in my mental universe. So it's kind of like that. The Great Dharani, I'm going to teach a course on it in March. The Great Dharani is, so a Dharani means a long mantra. And a mantra is these syllables that have supposedly have some kind of effect in themselves, like Om, one syllable mantra, Om, is like a cosmic syllable. You can find the whole universe in that syllable, Om, you know? And there's a symbol for Om that I can't reproduce, but everyone's seen it, everyone's familiar with it. So, and that's like a very important kind of like magical, powerful symbol, powerful symbol. So the Great Dharani is a very long mantra. That's what a Dharani is. And it is directed, some people call it the Great Dharani of compassion, the Great Compassionate Dharani. That's what the Japanese call it. And the Great Dharani exists in Sanskrit, Korean pronunciation of Chinese, Japanese pronunciation of Chinese, and Tibetan. All the non-Theravada Buddhist cultures. I don't think it fits into Theravada very well. And it's connected with something called the Great Dharani Sutra. And it has a lot of sort of magical power, I should say magical power is sort of projected onto it. It's associated with a lot of sort of magical power. So growing up in a shamanistic culture, knowing that the Great Dharani has this kind of very powerful affect. Zen Master Sung San's personal meditation practice was reciting the Great Dharani very fast, like maybe 20 or 30 seconds or something like that, Think about it. It takes us 5 minutes for us to chant it, and he did it like 20 or 30 seconds. So you must perceive the whole thing. You perceive it, So that was actually his personal practice. And so, yes, he would say that demons do not like the Great Dharani. It fits exactly into the culture that he grew up in. And he would have told Bobby to chant it as a way of protecting herself. Not just, calming herself down, but also as a way of protecting herself, sort of like weaving a spell around herself to protect herself from the vibes of this guy. So that's how it fits in. What we do with our conscious minds, how we perceive these things, or even our unconscious minds, how we perceive these things comes very much from the culture that we come from. And it's really not that important. What's important is clarity and seeing things as they really are. That's what's important. And we have all these tools to use. So when Bobby's reciting the Great Dharani, she's not reciting it in the same way that Zen Master Sung San is, even if she did do it in 20 or 30 seconds, which I don't think that's what she was doing. But when she's reciting the Great Dharani, she's doing it differently than when Zen Master Sung San is. And I'm doing it differently than Zen Master Sung San is. And maybe everyone in this room is doing it differently from everyone else in the way we look at it. But we still chant it together. That's what's important, the action of chanting together. And perceiving that community and that clarity in that community. That's what's important. So thank you for your question. And take the class. Yeah, there's a lot written about the Great Dharani and the Great Dharani Sutra. I'm really looking forward to preparing for the class. Yeah, I have a big file on my computer of documents about it. Are there any other questions?
I was wondering, regarding the topic of gossip.
About gossip, yeah.
Gossiping sometimes, but I always feel bad after.
You always feel bad after you gossip.
Yes, but I was wondering, is there ever a place for gossip? Because I heard it's a way of assessing other people's values
Okay, so is there, I have to translate for the people on, so is there a place for gossip because you have read that it's a way of assessing other people's values, seeing if you cohere with their values, and so on and so forth. And there are other sort of ways in which gossip is a social lubricant. Yeah.
So, but maybe values are a perception.
But maybe values are perception. Let's stick with gossip. Of course, values are a perception. But so there's a difference between gossip and information. Like we chanted for De Kwang Sinim today. Many of you know him. You know, he used to practice here as a monk. And I got a text rather, yesterday saying De Kwang Sinim is in the hospital. He has high blood pressure. And I WhatsApped him. He doesn't do text. I WhatsApped him and said, "Are you okay?" And he said, "Oh, I'm probably getting out tomorrow." And I said, "Well, get out and stay out." You know? But so we chanted for him today. Now, somebody saying, somebody you know is in the hospital, that's not gossip. That's information. Somebody who says, and this is not true of De Kwang Sinim, but I'll take high blood pressure as an example. You know, this guy that we know, he has so much salt. He's always eating pickles and French fries and potato chips. No wonder he's in the hospital for high blood pressure. You know, that's gossip. Okay? So there's a line. So gossip comes with judgment. You're judging this person's behavior, it's good or it's bad, or, you know, it's whatever. You're judging someone's behavior, that's gossip. Information is something else. Yeah, you want to know when someone's in the hospital that you care about. So that's the difference.
But isn't it like, you know, if eating salt leads to high blood pressure, isn't that information?
If eating salt leads to high blood pressure, isn't that information? So eating salt leads to high blood pressure information, you know?
That's factual.
Donald eats salt and that's why he has high blood pressure. That's not information. That's gossip about Donald, okay? The other thing about gossip is it tends to create an in and an out. You know, gossip is not filled with care for the person. Gossip is, look at us, we're so superior. We can gossip about this person who, you know, did whatever. So yeah, gossip always has a little bit of malice to it. So yeah. Great. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, let's stop the recording.